Every time Nintendo brings out a new game, they have to think of exciting mechanics and things to show the players. Otherwise, it will just feel like the last game, which kinda became a problem in the new Super Mario Bros. Series, since that didn't change a whole lot in the end. However, in the early days, when games like Super Mario Bros. 3 and World were released, Nintendo was being very creative, creating wonderful enemies like the Charging Chucks, who served quite a unique role in the games. We saw them in the 90s, but then not as much anymore after that. Well, let's find out how they evolved over time in terms of use, design, story, and gameplay. These beasts are large and burly Koopas that wear American football gear, so it's quite clear what their inspiration was. When Super Mario World came around the corner for the SNES console, these guys became common enemies and are quite durable against damage. A real tank in the field who will give Mario a hard time, and almost nothing in the game can stop these sports heroes, because they can also attack in a variety of ways, including throwing baseballs, kicking footballs, and flinging rocks with a shovel. But, as their name suggests, they can also charge. And when they do, rotating blocks and grab blocks can't even stop them. Even Yoshi cannot eat them. And these guys become even more aggressive when they see the green little thing. Clearly, Nintendo put them in the game to serve one role: stopping the player from advancing through the level no matter what. Every time you see them, they will go all in, and taking them out is usually not an option. So, it's quite obvious what's gonna happen as soon as you see one. So of course, Nintendo came up with even more sneaky ways of harassing you with these enemies. Because some types have less direct attack patterns, such as splitting into 3 and charging forward, and summoning or alerting other enemies nearby, such as Super Koopas and Rip Van Fish, using a whistle. This makes them more diverse and not just an obvious show of brute force. And it also allows Nintendo to create traps and surprising scenarios. Because when you hear the whistle, you're in for a real attack, which is supposed to catch the player off guard. There's even one type of Charging Chuck who has the habit of jumping in one place and clapping, which makes it really hard to get past them, which is exactly their goal, acting as some sort of last defense, which you can only get past with good timing and jumping, adding another type of barrier for the player. Often they're even found right before the end of the level, which can make them even more frustrating. In the end, there were a total of 8 different Charging Chucks in this game, which is an absolutely insane number to be honest. The ones we see are the Lookout Chuck, Confused Chuck, Passing Chuck, Clapping Chuck, Splitting Chuck, Digging Chuck, Bouncing Chuck, and Whistling Chuck, all having different strategies for taking on that nasty player and working well with the ideas seen in the levels we fight them in. There's no other enemy as far as I know that got this many different types as soon as they were seen in one game. Clearly Nintendo wanted to make them a big part of this new title, and they did so successfully. No one can even imagine Super Mario World without them. If you would take them out of the game completely, then a lot of different spots in the game would be empty, and replacing them would take a lot of effort because of their diverse selection of attacks and strategies. However, while Nintendo seemed to absolutely love them in this title, they weren't seen in the next game, or even the one after that. Only in Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island we saw enemies which were also inspired by classic American sports, like baseball. Think of enemies like the Sluggers, who use their baseball bats to return Yoshi eggs that you try to throw at them, which will push Yoshi backwards upon contact. But they can also be jumped on. Or the Zeus guys, who are fighters that are usually found in groups of 2 and fire balls of energy at you. And if you get too close, they will kick or punch you even. Although these guys are also kind of inspired by Street Fighter, of course. Although our beloved American football players, the Charging Chucks, were seen nowhere. For years upon years, they weren't part of the Super Mario games and weren't seen that much in spin-off games either. But after being absent for over 10 years, they finally came back in Super Mario 3D World, which also marked their first appearance in a 3D game. Just like in the last one, they're tough to take out, but it has gotten a lot better and easier. Landing 2 perfect hits on the head will take them out, although after the first they do get very angry. And certain items can take out a Charging Chuck with one blow, such as a bomb, so they have specific weaknesses as well. Now of course they were put in a 3D world all of a sudden, and normally this has a huge effect on enemies who were created for a 2D world. While here, all of it actually worked out extremely well. Their attacks still function perfectly in such a world. However, a lot of the special types that we saw in Super Mario World did disappear. As you can imagine, stuff like jumping and clapping in place isn't as useful in a setting like this because you can just go around the enemy. However, this charging attack is still extremely useful, maybe even more than it was in the older games, because they now have new movement options as well. They even did something really cool with them, because in the game, Mario and his friends sometimes get teleported into a really small room. Here you will sometimes end up with a number of charging chucks who will all immediately attack you. This is both a nerve-wracking surprise, as well as a fun challenge for the player, and a role like this works incredibly well for this enemy. It's one of the new options Nintendo has now they're in a 3D world, and to be honest, it was a genius idea of them. So in general, it seems like they've found a new role in the modern 3D Mario games after being gone for ages. And as you can imagine, Nintendo took full advantage of this, because they were even seen in a lot of spin-off titles during the time. In both games that fit more with the Super Mario series like Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, as well as more odd ones like Mario and Luigi games. In these games, they still have a similar role, being very tough and charging at the heroes to take them out for Bowser. I especially like them in the Toad spin-off game, since they are such aggressive enemies while Toad is quite fragile. He's a slow little man that can't really attack any enemies seen in the game, so charging Chuck can be quite dangerous since they do attack you and are a lot faster than you, making it fit extremely well in this entire game. I like the way they chase and harass you in the train level, and even in the Mario and Luigi games they sometimes send a whole army after you, which is fitting with the enemies as well as a challenge for the player. It's like an entire American football team going after you. So they were making a real comeback all of a sudden, even using them again in the very next title on a brand new system called the Switch. I'm of course talking about the game Super Mario Odyssey. Here they can be found in the underground moon caverns of the Moon Kingdom, and a secret area in the Ruined Kingdom that can be reached using a moon pipe. And the cool thing is, the game is known for the capture mechanic. So of course you can take over one of these enemies if you get rid of their helmets. And it might be because of the helmets that they were put in the game in the first place. When being in this form, you can charge through boulders and at enemies at high speed, but you aren't able to jump while being one. Now, while the idea is really cool, they sadly enough don't use them a whole lot, and only in a small amount of instances. Which is kind of disappointing, to be honest, because the stuff seen in this game is really cool, and I like it a lot. You can become a walking tank for once, and really go to town. It's a bit similar to when you take over Bowser in the game, and stuff like getting past the boulders which are coming your way across the narrow patch are short but sweet. But in such a situation, you do notice that an idea like this only works in a 3D world if you limit the player's movement a lot. Otherwise, they might as well move around it all and not capture any charging chuck to solve the problem. But while the ideas were good in the game, they were only seen in 2 instances, so Nintendo's love for them faded quite quickly once again. Even in new titles like Super Mario Maker 2, we don't see these enemies at all, even though they were first seen in a 2D game. Heck, one of the styles seen in this game is Super Mario World, where the charging chucks are originally from. And even the older ones made for the 3DS and Wii U don't feature these classic enemies who belong in a title like this for sure. Now maybe they will be seen in the game after a new update, but the chances of that happening are quite slim. Although I would certainly welcome a new update with the charging chucks in them, because they 100% belong in the Super Mario Maker games, and it would also be a lot of fun to use them in levels. However, while this is where the journey of the charging chuck kind of ends, there's one other thing I want to mention. At some point in time, Nintendo did create a new type of enemy that's similar in a lot of ways to the charging chucks, and also had a bigger role in the 2D titles. And while they aren't related, I do want to talk about them for a bit, because it might explain why these classic foes from Super Mario World never really returned in the new Super Mario Bros. Series. The enemies I'm talking about are the Bruisers, who are boxing ghosts and seem to be some sort of a combination of a Boo and a charging chuck in a way. They are humanoids wearing a grey sheet over their body, wear brown shoes, and have deep red boxing gloves. And surprisingly enough, we started seeing them in New Super Mario Bros. For the DS, which was the reboot of the 2D games after Nintendo was done with their collection of 3D games. Just like the charging chucks, they're really strong and go straight after you, similar to how the chucks charged at you. They blindly run into the direction of the player, punching at anything in their way. So you can already see why I made the connection between these 2 enemies. It seems like some of the vital roles that the charging chuck played in Super Mario World have been replaced with this enemy. That's why we most likely didn't see our favorite American football player anymore. A new version took his place. Even though they do the same thing for the most part. And by the looks of it, Nintendo did this to introduce a new mechanic tied to this enemy, because they can be useful to the player, since they can actually punch through otherwise unbreakable bricks for you, allowing you to reach certain items and star coins that you could otherwise never get, and this mechanic seems to be the reason for putting them in the game, even though an enemy like the Charging Chuck could have also served this role, but instead Nintendo made a new enemy who was seen in many different new Super Mario Bros. Games after, and that's sadly enough where our story really ends. It seemed like Nintendo really liked the idea of the Charging Chuck in the beginning, but quite quickly they gave up on it, only returning every now and then, but not very often.